The wind over Tora Bora carried a texture few could describe. Thin, high-altitude air threaded with dust and snow, whispering across ridgelines like something half alive. Below those ridges, a small US Special Forces unit crouched in silence, their radios hissing quietly as they waited for command's voice. It was early winter 2002. The air felt older than the century. A crackle broke through. Coordinates, orders, a tone of routine professionalism. Proceed north by grid 27. Nothing unusual. The men repeated the command, their voices muffled by scarves and static. Then came the pause, those 2 seconds between acknowledgement and confirmation that every soldier learns to wait for. But confirmation never came. The radio hummed softly, then fell still. No voice, no static, no signal at all. At first, they assumed the terrain had blocked the relay. They repositioned the antenna, recalibrated the frequency. The valley around them remained quiet, soundless in a way that pressed against the eardrums. Even the wind seemed to lose interest. One of them tapped the radio body with a gloved hand, expecting that sharp feedback pop. Nothing. A brief exchange passed between them, calm, almost casual. They were trained for this. Loss of comms, terrain interference, temporary blackouts. Still, something about the silence unsettled them. It was too perfect, too final. The sound of absence carried its own weight. Overhead, the sky dimmed with the onset of dusk, turning the snowfields into plains of pale silver. The mountains loomed, vast and indifferent. In their cold shadow, the last transmission hung unfinished, its echo swallowed somewhere between stone and static. Like a sentence the world decided not to complete. At command, the first missing transmission raised no alarm. Static blackouts were common in those mountains, the kind of interference caused by sharp ridges and mineral-rich stone. Operators logged it, repeated the call sign, and waited for a response that never came. Hours passed. The frequency remained open, silent yet clean, as if the air itself had swallowed the signal whole. By nightfall, command rerouted drones to sweep the area. Thermal scans showed nothing unusual. Faint heat signatures, the soft pulse of a campfire, movement indistinguishable from the drifting cold. Yet even the drones returned with corrupted audio logs. No hum, no wind, not even rotor noise, just mute recordings that played like empty tape. Technicians checked the lines, tested relays, recalibrated transmitters. Every system was operational. Every test tone rang out clear, until aimed at that one sector. Then absolute quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel like failure, but resistance. A stillness too precise to be random. In later years, when fragments of the operation surfaced through declassified notes, a small line appeared in the margins of a signal analysis report. Auditory void localized to Tora Bora sector grid Delta 7. The analyst had underlined the phrase twice, then circled it, perhaps out of disbelief or recognition. Inside the mountain range, a mile above the valley floor, the missing unit's coordinates flickered faintly on the monitor. Position static, heart rate beacons intact. But their voices never returned. For 24 hours the desert air refused to carry sound. It was as if that part of the world had chosen silence as its defense, sealing itself from every frequency that sought to name it. When the search teams arrived at the valley's edge, they brought with them an Afghan guide named Rahim, a thin man with a soft voice and eyes that seemed older than the war itself. He had grown up near these slopes, herding goats in summers when the air was thin and the light could turn white against the cliffs. When asked about the missing patrol, he hesitated, looking toward the horizon as though measuring how much truth could safely be spoken. "In my village," he said quietly, "we call that place Goshko, the mountain that listens." His translator repeated the words for the Americans, uncertain whether it was meant as warning or poetry. Rahim continued, his tone steady, almost respectful. "If you speak too loud in those caves, it remembers your voice. Sometimes it repeats it when you are far away." The soldiers chuckled, polite and tired. Folklore, they thought, belonged to another world, one with ghosts and spirits, not encrypted radios and infrared drones. They asked Rahim what it means for a mountain to listen. He shrugged, saying only, "The stones there do not forget sound." Later that night, as the team set up comms relays, the phrase echoed softly between them. "The mountain that listens." It sounded absurd but oddly fitting. Even their own voices felt thinner here, fading faster than normal speech. The wind had a way of carrying words off mid-sentence, as if something invisible were taking them. In the morning, Rahim prayed facing the peaks. The Americans watched in silence, respectful, curious. None of them noticed how the valley seemed to hold its breath, as though listening, just a little closer than before. By the third evening, the temperature had dropped enough that their breath fogged against the cave walls. The team switched to infrared. The night vision scopes washed the world in muted greens and reds. Every contour shimmered faintly, as if the stone itself were breathing. Inside the tunnel, sound moved strangely. The click of a rifle bolt or crunch of gravel seemed to echo a heartbeat too late. They called it ghost latency, a running joke to keep nerves steady. But the delay was real, measurable. Footsteps played twice. Whispers seemed to circle back from behind them. When one soldier laughed, the echo returned, a softer version, one he didn't quite recognize as his own. The cave walls were close but smooth, shaped by centuries of wind and water. They gave off no reflection, yet sometimes the thermal scanner picked up duplicates, faint silhouettes beside the living ones, delayed by seconds, moving out of sync. The readings couldn't be explained by heat bleed or interference. The system wasn't malfunctioning, it was mimicking. Sergeant Miles tapped the display with a gloved finger and muttered that the cave was recording them, like a looped tape. The men laughed, but nobody corrected him. Each time they stopped moving, they could still hear the faint crunch of boots continuing for a few steps beyond. They spoke less as night deepened. The stillness wasn't oppressive. It was thoughtful, attentive. Somewhere above them, the wind moaned through narrow shafts, hollow and deliberate, like a slow intake of breath. One by one, the soldiers began to sense that the mountain wasn't merely echoing, it was remembering. When they finally powered down the infrared scopes to rest, the afterimages of their own bodies lingered behind their eyelids, silhouettes that refused to fade, standing perfectly still in the dark. They gathered around a dim blue lantern, its glow trembling against the cave walls. Outside, the wind pressed softly at the entrance, steady as a pulse. The men ate in silence until Rahim, the interpreter, broke it with a quiet thought. He spoke English well, but his stories carried the rhythm of another language, slower, more deliberate. "My grandfather fought here," he said, gesturing toward the stone. "Not in your war, the one before, when the Soviets came." The soldiers looked up. The firelight painted his face in uneven lines, the wrinkles deep like small ravines. "He told me there was a patrol, 6 men, who went inside this same cave. They were searching for weapons caches. They never came back. Someone asked if they were killed." Rahim shook his head. "When they found them weeks later, the bodies were sitting upright, rifles in their hands, no wounds. Their journals were still open." He paused, fingers tightening around the canteen. The last page said they heard voices behind the stone, voices that spoke in their own accents, repeating their words a moment late. The soldiers exchanged glances, half amusement, half unease. One joked that maybe the mountain had learned Russian. Rahim smiled faintly, but his eyes stayed fixed on the dark corridor behind them. "When the Soviets left," he said, "people sealed the cave for years. They said it was better that the mountain stayed quiet." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying a low whistle through the narrow passage. It sounded almost like speech, stretched thin across the air. The men turned toward it instinctively, but Rahim didn't move. He only whispered, "It remembers sound." The lantern flickered once, and for a brief moment, their shadows on the wall seemed to stand apart, like listeners waiting to be spoken to. The second night was colder. Frost had begun to trace the edges of their equipment, thin as cobwebs, delicate as dust. Private Lorne took the early watch, sitting near the tunnel mouth where the air met darkness. The cave exhaled a faint chill that didn't move like normal wind. It came in pulses, soft, rhythmic, almost human. He adjusted his headset, thinking it might be feedback from the mic pressed beneath his collar. But the pattern continued. Inhale, exhale, pause. He held his breath to listen. The rhythm stopped with him. When he exhaled, it resumed. Slower, deeper, matching his own pace as though the stone were listening for instruction. He felt it again near his ear, a whisper of warmth against the cold air, impossible in that temperature. The sensation wasn't frightening, just deeply wrong in its familiarity. He switched channels, whispered a test phrase to the comms. "Check. 1, 2. The playback came through, faintly delayed, a layer of breath behind his own. Another soldier, half asleep, grumbled that the cave was mimicking them again. They laughed softly, unwilling to feed the tension, but none of them turned off their mics. In the morning, when they reviewed the recordings, the audio carried faint exhalations between words, not random bursts of static, but measured, almost synchronized with the heart rate monitors on their wrists. The lieutenant noted it down as a pressure anomaly. The report didn't mention that a few of them had started breathing differently afterward. Slower, shallower, as if their lungs were waiting for something else to lead. By evening, the cave air had grown heavier. Even the flicker of the lantern seemed to pulse in time with their breaths, and somewhere beneath the mountain's skin, a sound lingered. Not loud, not near, but steady, like the earth itself learning to breathe. When they finally stepped out of the cave, the light felt wrong. Too still, too weightless, as if the sun had been holding its breath. Their boots crunched over loose shale and frozen sand, but even that sound seemed dulled, as though filtered through glass. They blinked against the brightness, realizing the day looked exactly as it had when they entered. Same clouds, same hue of afternoon gold. Yet by every estimate, they had been inside for nearly 72 hours. Lorne checked his watch. The display read a single day gone. No error, no skipped interval. The others compared theirs. All synchronized, all wrong. Sergeant Miles lifted his wrist to the light, staring as if he could will time back into motion. "Maybe we miscounted," someone said, but the words carried no conviction. The silence between sentences felt elastic, stretching longer than it should. The landscape offered no reassurance. Their shadows fell long across the slope, yet the sun still hovered high, refusing to dip toward the ridgeline. It wasn't bright, not really, just constant, unwavering, like the backlight of a display frozen on one frame. They unpacked the comm set, antenna extended toward the open sky. Miles keyed the mic, his voice calm and procedural. "Echo team to command, requesting check-in." Nothing. He repeated the call on secondary frequency. Only the faint hum of the transmitter answered. Smooth, metallic, endless. Rahim shaded his eyes, scanning the distance. "It is the same day," he murmured. "The mountain kept it," no one replied. The phrase didn't sound poetic anymore. It sounded factual, like coordinates. As the light held steady and the cold refused to deepen, the men stood suspended between hours, caught in a day that no longer wanted to end, under a sun that seemed to have forgotten how to move. Years after the incident, when fragments of Operation Echo were quietly declassified, a small brown notebook surfaced among the recovered gear. The label on its cover was faded, the paper stiff with sand. Inside, written in careful block letters, was the field journal of Sergeant Thomas Miles. The first pages were routine, coordinates, equipment checks, weather notes. Then the tone changed. The entries grew sparse, the handwriting slower, as if written during long pauses between breaths. "Third night. Something moving beneath us. Not rock slides, not tremors. Marching. Steady pace. 40 beats per minute, maybe less. Feels organized." The next line, ink pressed deeper into the paper. "They aren't ghosts. They're echoes looking for a host." Analysts later described the phrasing as metaphor, the result of exhaustion and stress, but the rhythm in his words mirrored the acoustic readings from that night. Low, patterned vibrations, too regular for geology. He had felt them through the soles of his boots, the same pulse he claimed could be heard if you held your ear against the cave floor. "The sound isn't coming from below," he wrote, but from behind the sound itself. Further entries became more fragmented, almost lyrical. Descriptions of footsteps that never arrive, of time folding like fabric, of the mountain's memory replaying what it once swallowed. No direct mention of fear, only fatigue, and a growing tenderness toward whatever presence he believed listened from the dark. The final page contained no words at all, just the faint imprint of pressure, as if his pen had paused mid-sentence and never resumed. When archivists examined it under infrared light, they found a shallow groove shaped like the start of a single word. "We," the rest remained blank, the paper quiet, holding its silence like unfinished breath. The recovered transmission was only 43 seconds long. It surfaced weeks after the unit's disappearance, buried in the corrupted data logs of an unmanned reconnaissance drone. The file was labeled simply Echo 3B Wava. Analysts restored what they could. What remained began with faint static, the kind that usually fills dead air between signals. Then came breathing. Slow, deliberate, steady, human. At first it sounded like one person, then two, overlapping by half a heartbeat. The rhythm wasn't chaotic. It was synchronized, almost rehearsed. Every inhalation seemed mirrored by another, slightly delayed. In the background, a metallic scraping rose and fell. Not harsh, but consistent, like metal sliding over stone in patient intervals. At the 30-second mark, a voice entered, low and close to the mic. "Do you hear it breathing back?" The sentence ended on the soft click of a swallowed breath. Then silence, not the ordinary kind. A total absence of sound, as if the recording itself had stopped receiving the idea of noise. Signal specialists analyzed the file for weeks. Spectrograms revealed overlapping sound layers, frequencies that mirrored one another almost perfectly, as though recorded twice on separate channels and folded into one. When inverted, the background static produced faint patterns resembling speech. A few claimed to hear words. Others said it sounded like distant marching. The report filed it under acoustic duplication anomaly. Those who listened repeatedly described a strange physical reaction, a tightening in the chest, the sensation of their own breathing falling into sync with the recording. One technician noted in the margin, "Playback seems to listen back. The file remains archived under restricted access." No one has explained why, at the very end, the waveform spikes upward, not from sound, but from something measured in rhythm alone, like the pulse of an unseen lung. 3 days after their disappearance, the patrol returned. It happened at dawn. The same colorless light that had followed them into the mountains seemed to escort them back out. A reconnaissance team spotted movement on the eastern ridge, 6 figures descending slowly, single file, against the glare of snow. From a distance, they looked uninjured. Closer, something about their movement felt wrong. Too steady, too measured, as if rehearsed. None of them spoke. When the recovery convoy reached them, they offered no resistance. Their faces were pale beneath a thin crust of frost, lips cracked but calm, helmets in place, weapons slung neatly across their backs, as though stepping out of a training exercise. Their vitals checked normal. Not one of them showed signs of dehydration or fatigue. Yet their eyes, when light passed through them, seemed unfocused, reflecting not the morning sun, but something deeper, something dim. The medics asked questions. The men answered in short, delayed sentences, voices strangely synchronized. "We're fine." We walked back. We didn't stop. Nothing else. Only Sergeant Miles said more, 5 words that unsettled even the interpreter. "We didn't come back," he murmured, staring past the snowbanks toward the cave mouth. It did. They were escorted down the valley under quiet protocol. No stretchers, no visible injury, just a slow procession of silence. Their boots left shallow impressions in the frost, and yet, for reasons later noted in reports, no one remembered hearing their steps. Inside the temporary command post, the men sat side by side on folding chairs, motionless while medical personnel conducted basic checks. Pulse steady, pupils responsive, temperature normal. When asked to describe what happened, each soldier paused before answering, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Their words were identical in order and phrasing, recited like coordinates. "We followed the light. Then we were outside." Command logged the encounter under operational return. Cameras recorded every frame. In the footage, something subtle happens. A faint distortion whenever one of them exhales, the image bending slightly at the edges. No technician could reproduce it. That evening, the mountains disappeared behind low cloud. The search teams pulled back. The cave remained unentered, and in the debrief tent, 6 men sat in silence, breathing in perfect unison, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The debrief began 48 hours after recovery. Inside, a sealed prefabricated structure flown in for the purpose. The soldiers were separated into individual rooms lined with canvas and steel, each fitted with a single camera, biometric sensors, and a looping sound test meant to measure attention. Their responses were logged in real time. Every answer, every silence, recorded. The transcripts, later declassified in fragments, read less like testimony and more like reflection. The men didn't argue, didn't contradict each other. Each spoke with the same calm, deliberate tone, as if reciting from a shared script none of them remembered writing. When asked to describe what occurred inside the cave, Private Lorne replied, "We weren't lost, we were being kept still." Sergeant Miles said, "We were observed from within." Another soldier described feeling watched from inside my own head, as though his eyes were looking back at him from a distance. Medical officers conducted full examinations. Blood work was clean, hydration normal, yet every subject displayed disrupted circadian rhythms, heart rate spiking at irregular intervals, REM cycles inverted, cortisol levels abnormally low. They slept soundly, dreamlessly, but awoke exhausted, claiming they had forgotten how to feel time. A psychologist from Bagram Airfield labeled the condition temporal disassociation. His notes describe an absence of subjective duration, as if the men's perception of cause and effect had flattened into one continuous moment. He recommended extended rest and cognitive recalibration, but the file ends abruptly. Stamped review classified. Audio contamination probable. What audio contamination meant was never publicly clarified. The only surviving clue lies in a footnote appended by a communications officer. Echoes persisted in the isolation chambers, delayed breathing patterns, possible residual mimicry effect. When the soldiers were released weeks later, each was transferred to separate bases across different regions. Contact between them was discouraged. None protested. According to one unverified account, when two of them accidentally crossed paths months later, they stopped mid-conversation, then fell silent at the exact same second, as though listening to something only they could hear. Officially, Operation Echo was closed under the designation environmental interference. Unofficially, no one ever entered the listening mountain again. The coordinates remain blacked out in every map revision since, replaced by a blank patch of grey terrain. A digital silence echoing the one that started it all. He had been retired for nearly 20 years when the file surfaced again. The analyst, one of the few remaining from the original Tora Bora operations, found the audio by accident, buried in a mislabeled archive drive sent for disposal. The folder name read Obsolete Frequencies. Inside it, a single waveform file, echo 3b.wav. He remembered it immediately, the sound that haunted the analysis room for weeks. Back then, they had all agreed it was interference, some kind of signal feedback between relay towers. But he had never been fully convinced. Silence that perfect didn't occur by chance. It had shape, weight, design. Now, decades later, he sat in his small home office surrounded by paper maps and dusty receivers, a mug of cold tea beside him. He connected his old headphones, pressed play, and closed his eyes. The sound began exactly as he remembered. Faint static, breath, rhythm, two patterns, slightly out of sync, gradually aligning. One of them was human. The other, he wasn't sure. He leaned closer, instinct returning like an old muscle memory. His heart rate slowed to match the beat. The breaths on the tape were not random. They adjusted subtly, responding to his own. He smiled, not in fear but recognition. We were taught to measure signal, he whispered to himself. Not silence, but silence too carries data. The waveform flickered on the screen, repeating in loops. Each time, the amplitude shifted minutely, as though compensating for his breathing. He let it play, no longer analyzing, simply listening. The more he did, the more he realized the sound wasn't answering him. It was remembering him. For a moment, the room seemed to exhale. The air felt denser, familiar, as though something in it had been waiting all these years for a listener to return. He removed the headphones slowly, careful not to disturb the rhythm. The waveform continued to pulse faintly on the monitor even after playback stopped, like a residual heartbeat refusing to fade. He noted the time, the date, the coordinates of the file. Old habits. Then, almost without thinking, he whispered toward the still air. You learned our rhythm, didn't you? The speakers, lifeless seconds ago, released one soft sigh, barely audible, yet unmistakable. He sat back in his chair, smiling faintly. Then I suppose, he murmured. We finally made contact. The footage that closes the file is simple. Grainy, still images of the Tora Bora range, each one frozen in the same soft haze. The ridges rise like the ribs of some enormous creature sleeping beneath snow. There is no movement, only drifting light. The images were taken months after the operation ended, though they could have been captured a century earlier. Nothing in them reveals time. A slow, measured voice begins to speak. Archival narration from an unidentified source. The tone is calm, almost devotional. Perhaps the shadows of Tora Bora were not what we lost, it says, but what listened back. The words hover, faintly distorted, as though played through an old reel-to-reel machine with dust on the head. Behind the voice, a low wind rises, not a sound effect, but the genuine audio of the valley, caught by the camera's open microphone. It fills the silence like breath returning to lungs. One frame lingers longer than the others. The mouth of the listening mountain, pale mist curling from its entrance. The edges flicker under compression, creating the illusion of movement, as if the darkness inside were subtly pulsing. The effect is almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably alive. Then, nothing. No fade out, no music, just stillness. The kind that invites the listener to lean closer, expecting another word that never comes. Minutes pass in that quiet. The silence stretches but does not break. Some say the audio of that final reel carries a hidden frequency, a subsonic tone only certain recorders can capture. Others claim it is merely environmental resonance, but those who've watched it describe the same experience, an instinctive need to breathe slower, to match the rhythm of the valley. It is not fear that settles in, but calm, an awareness of how vast and patient silence can be. The last frame dissolves into black. For a few seconds, even the equipment hum seems to pause. Then faintly, a sound returns. Not wind, not voice, just the suggestion of presence. A breath too distant to measure. And as the final seconds drift by, it becomes unclear whether the mountain is listening or whether we are.